I'm delighted you're actually able to join us here in Melbourne for the 13th Australasian Conference on Child Abuse and Neglect, organised for the first time by my agency, the Australian Institute of Criminology, with the sponsorship and support of the Victorian Department of Human Services, the International Society for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect, ACCAN, the Australian Centre for Child Protection at University of South Australia, the Institute for Child Protection Studies at the Australian Catholic University, and the National Association for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect, NAPCAN. As I was saying that, I realised I'm actually attached to 4 of the 6 of those agencies, so it was probably a bit of nepotism or, sort of support going on, but we all share the similar goals around trying to work better to improve children's health and well-being, so I think it's a great group to have associated with us. Now, you might have already picked up there are actually quite a few competing events in this sector this year. I was surprised at just how many have sort of grown in the last 4 years since the last ACCAN conference was run. But I think we've still established a pretty much a quality program. We've got keynote speakers, including Associate Professor Eileen Cummings from Charles Darwin University, who's well known across the Northern Territory for her ongoing work engaging Indigenous people in family violence issues. We've got Justice Peter McClellan, AM, Chair of the Royal Commission, Institutional Responses to Sexual Abuse. We've got Professor Louise Newman, AM, Professor of Developmental Psychiatry at Monash University. Paul Nixon, the Chief Social Worker at the Child, Youth and Family Services New Zealand, and Professor Stephen Smallbone, Director of Griffith Youth Forensic Service at Griffith University. And a whole range of papers, symposium, workshops that are going to cover a diverse range of areas, including child protection service responses, policing and the courts, health and welfare therapeutic interventions, and emerging issues in child abuse and neglect and child protection policy and practice reform. The 4-day program has, I think, over 36 concurrent sessions, 15 or 16 workshops, 6 symposia. There's plenty to go along and see, so I'd certainly encourage you to do so and make the most of the opportunity that's been presented. But we also know it's equally important that we have a bit of time to actually have a chat. Networking is a core part of conferences, and we've tried to allow time for you to get to meet your colleagues, to talk about things you've heard about, to discuss issues, to learn from each other. And that's why we've got the networking reception tonight after these formalities, and also another reception on Tuesday evening to facilitate mingling, and I guess to reward you for having survived very long days of intensive work. So why run the event? ACCAN has been a cornerstone event for the sector. It's tailored as it has been to the Australasian child protection fields. I actually attended my first ACCAN in 1993 in Brisbane, so I'm pretty old. That was the 4th of its kind. I don't know whatever happened to the 1st, 2nd or 3rd. I've never found any reference to them anywhere, but I believe they occurred. But I went to the 4th and it was great. And I kept going every 2 years to the successive events that occurred up until the 12th conference, which was run successfully in combination with the 8th ACCAN Asia Pacific Conference in Perth in 2009. And after 2009, we all thought, okay, there'll be another one in 2011. One of the jurisdictions would put up their hands and offer to host it. But unfortunately, and we don't know why, that never happened. And so ACCAN ceased, and there was no 2011 conference. And then late last year and early this year, I sort of decided, well, maybe we could try and resurrect the event and have the AIC run it. But again, trying to partner with the Statutory Child Protection Department, as it always been done in the past. So I was really pleased that DHS Victoria were able to join us in sponsoring this event. And with the revival of this important meeting, we have the opportunity as colleagues to share knowledge and research and test innovative ideas that will be presented over the next few days. Now, the theme chosen for the conference is Protecting Children, New Solutions to Old Problems, which reflects the need to innovate and to enhance responses to key policy and practice issues across the sectors involved in preventing and responding to child abuse and neglect. In 2001, Kofi Annan, the then Secretary-General of the UN, said that the desire for our children's well-being has always been the most universally cherished aspiration of humankind, and he recognised that a lot of progress had been made since the UN was formed, and that each new generation of children has had a greater chance of surviving and thriving than the one before, and this is important. In 2012, we marked the 50-year anniversary since the publication of Henry Kemp's seminal paper, The Battered Child Syndrome, and it's therefore timely to reflect on just how far we've come since then. And I think it's fair to say that the more we have learned about child abuse and neglect and protecting children in the last 50 years, the more we have also realised what a complex problem it is. From Kemp's focus on physical abuse, we now have societal level recognition of child sexual abuse, emotional and psychological harm, and a particular focus on exposure to domestic violence. And we recognise the co-occurrence of the various forms of maltreatment, You find one form of maltreatment, you're often going to find some other forms present in the child's life. In recent years, our attention has turned to the online world and the revolution of online child exploitation. Throughout it all, some would argue that neglect, recognised in its various forms since the early days of colonisation and way beyond that in other cultures, the most prevalent form of maltreatment, and one that we still know, or we do know, can have substantial effects on children's lives, is still relatively treated, I think, as a poor cousin. It's not always given the attention it's deserved, despite the impacts that it can have. Overall, the definitions of harm have changed as our understandings of what maltreatment is have changed and expanded. From a focus on overt signs of poverty, crime and family structure, we now know much more about the range and interaction of a multitude of child, family and community factors that can impact on the incidence of child maltreatment, nicely organised by Yuri Bronfenbrenner into an ecological model of child development, and with thanks to Jay Belsky, who also refined the model further. We also recognise that particular roles of power and patriarchy and their relationship, particularly to sexual assault and violence against women. We recognise that apart from or hand in hand with poverty and financial hardship, parental substance abuse, mental disorders and intimate partner violence have become three defining characteristics of many of the families who now become well known to statutory child protection services. We have learnt and continue to learn about the importance of the early years in shaping a child's future and the impact of trauma on neurological functioning. In recent years, research has begun to show us the way experiences, particularly parenting, can influence the way some genes function and the implications this has for prevention and treatment. It's not nature or nurture, or it's nature and nurture, and this concept is being resurrected as a key way to frame our understanding and our responses. Because of such research, we know how important is the investment made to develop healthy babies and infants at a universal level, but with targeted resources for those more in need, to provide that now famous head start for youngsters who may struggle. We've seen the development of professional systems to protect children and support child and family wellbeing. While the centuries-old child and family support work undertaken by a range of NGOs is recognised and is updated and changed with the times, and continues as a key element of responses to child abuse and neglect. Since the 1970s, we've had government statutory child protection services or systems that have become the primary driver and a key decision maker for responding to suspected maltreatment concerns. And we know that with the best of intentions in the world, these systems are not perfect and they require further work. We have a range of treatment and prevention models that have been developed and assessed, although the quality of that assessment varies markedly and with a limited number of quality studies being completed in Australasia on Australasian populations. While the knowledge gains are often clearest in the health and medical field, there have also been a growing number of studies of psychological treatments, such as multisystemic approaches, also family group conferencing, trauma-focused cognitive behavioural therapy, such that overall we know a lot more about what works in helping children and families than we used to. But we do need more sustainable approaches and programs and the rigorous evaluation of these programs in an Australasian context. As the US National Research Council recently noted, we still need to better understand causation, to understand individual differences in how maltreatment is experienced and the subsequent outcomes experienced, so we can better tailor responses. We also need to know more about how to implement prevention and treatment in community settings, and the impact of changes to laws and policies for both practice and their effects on children and their families. How we frame the child maltreatment problem has also changed, and this has been driven particularly by the development and ratification of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which entered into force in 1989 and was ratified faster and by more countries than any previous human rights instrument. Signatories promised to protect children and to diminish their suffering, to promote the fullest development of their human potential and to make them aware of their needs, their rights and their opportunities. They also promised to uphold the far-reaching principle that children had first call on all resources, that they would always put the best interests of children first, in good times or bad, and I think we and most countries have a ways to go on this, but that said, the Convention has been foundational to the further development of systems that protect and support children and young people's health, well-being and rights. And in many other countries, it has clearly underpinned the development of the first formal welfare and child protection systems. While we have seen in the last 10 to 15 years the more universal public health, child welfare, family support type systems of Northern Europe developing or adding on more protection-focused or forensically focused approaches, as socioeconomic issues have begun to bite and as their populations have changed, We've seen the Anglo-American English-speaking Western democracies like Australia and New Zealand trying to pull back to varying extents from the very hardcore, forensically driven systems we've had in place in most jurisdictions since the 1990s. To re-engage in a system focused more on child and family support rather than investigation, labelling and statutory action. Recognising that a purely inquisitorial process is not required, is not ideal and can be harmful for many of the vulnerable children and their families in our communities where statutory action will never be required. In both types of systems, however, there's also been a rise in recognition of the rights of children and young people and the need to assist parents in their responsibilities as parents to develop the next generation to meet the needs of their children. There has been a concomitant rise in recognising the better outcomes that arise from working in partnership with parents and families for all. Benefits for all the players, the child, the family and the workers. An ongoing issue that we might get to as part of this conference, I hope, is the subject of Wednesday's final panel, which is how can we better engage the community or key sections of the community to move beyond reporting of concerns to other genuine actions to enhance child safety and well-being. But in general, moving away from primarily forensic approaches has not been easy to enact in Australia, and others have equally struggled. Systematic development and change is generally not driven by evidence. While we have evidence of how certain key components work best, for the most part the evidence of what systems work best and how hasn't been produced. The protection of children from child abuse and neglect has, more than many other areas of social concern, been driven by individual tragedies and the community's concern that systems put in place to make children safe from harm fail too often. In essence, a focus on the failures to protect from harm or the misuse of statutory power to break up families. These concerns have rightly led to extensive coronial investigations, the regular reporting and review of all child deaths, the recent extension of this practice to formal serious harm case reviews in some jurisdictions, and a very, very long series of broader departmental and government inquiries into core elements of child protection systems in most jurisdictions in Australia and also across the Western world. But the result is much of the structural change we've experienced since the 70s has been driven by tragedy, outrage and reviews to focus on the very worst outcomes for a subset of matters dealt with by the child protection system. This is not a new phenomenon. Since the first development of legislation to protect children from specific sorts of harms back in the 16th and 17th centuries in the US and the UK, change has often come about because of media portrayal of child abuse atrocities, inverted commas, and the community's outrage that has put pressure on governments to act. Similar things happened from the early years of white settlement in Australia and I think also in New Zealand. But it means that outrage has been the driver for change since the development of statutory systems in the 1970s. And the result is when big policy change comes, it's often come very quickly and with limited planning time. If you like, it's almost like a crisis response to a crisis. And when children still continue to be harmed and not protected by the system despite these changes, governments and child protection systems can seek to enact ongoing quick fixes to reduce the pressure, and these may not be well thought out, and they can also drive a system further into crisis. And we've seen this happening in varying parts of Australia over the last 15 years. But it's not all bad news. Some jurisdictions have actually experienced significant numbers of case failures, but have recognised the need to take the time to assess and review these cases while still staying a path of evidence-based, or probably more likely, evidence-informed policy and practice. While subject to criticism, and no doubt justified criticism in some circumstances, Victoria, for example, did develop a differentiated response to child protection, which they embedded in an enhanced child and family support network, which began in the late 1990s and has been going on into the mid to late 2000s. The multifaceted approach has reduced substantiated case numbers, and it also diverted vulnerable families from the statutory pathway to a more welfare-focused path. This can be seen as a success, although there have been some concerns raised that the new system has merely shifted maltreating families to the NGO sector, and the system has actually been failing to protect children still. And the reality is the system isn't perfect. Victoria has continued to have some case tragedies too, but this is one of the few Australian examples to my mind where government and a child protection department have held a policy line and used the available evidence to inform change despite not always getting it right. I think this is valuable as a practice direction in spite of its lack of perfection. We have a ways to go to enhance our approaches, acknowledging our failures, but taking an evidence-informed approach is surely a useful way forward. And I'm sure we're going to hear more about Victoria's practice over the next 3 days, and we have the Minister for Community Services Minister Wooldridge speaking tomorrow afternoon, and also the CEO or the Secretary of the Department coming along with her to present. So I'm sure we'll hear more about Victoria's approach. So what's next? Where will child protection systems go? What can we expect to see in terms of new solutions? First, in recent years, our systems have reached a maturity such that we now have historical assessments of how we did things and, again, where we failed. You never hear about the good stuff, you always hear about the failures. That's one of the bad sides of child protection work. Inquiries have taken place into the forced removal and placement of generations of Aboriginal and Islander children under the stolen generations. We've also seen inquiries into the treatment of all children in institutional care, the Forgotten Australians inquiry. And most recently, we now have the first National Royal Commission into institutional responses to sexual abuse. These serve as a mix of truth and reconciliation hearings. They provide a voice for those who have been harmed. They also inform ongoing policy and practice change to make our systems safer. Some enable some access to supports for the victim survivors, and they may also lead to the punishment of perpetrators who have harmed children ostensibly under the auspices of government or other professional service systems. I expect we'll hear more about the Royal Commission from Justice McClellan on Tuesday, as the Royal Commission takes us to a new level of assessment of our systems and has the power to recommend significant changes to governments that are essentially committed to enacting. Second, for the first time in 20 years, we actually have a national child protection framework. Actually, it's the first real one we've ever actually had. There was one in '92, it was never actually used for anything. So we've actually got one for the first time, a national perspective on how we might work to protect Australia's children, which is great. It's based on a public health model, a great model that most of us seem to ascribe to, including myself, but which many systems struggle to follow. It firmly positions statutory child protection and the crisis response to maltreated children within a preventative framework of universal services and targeted services for at-risk or vulnerable sections of our community. A public health model isn't new, but the framework is sound, and the preventative elements have some of the best evidence available of what makes a positive difference for children and families. Will the national framework and the whole of government actions in support of the framework allow us to shake off the focus and investment in crisis response and see a greater investment in the health, education and welfare infrastructure that would provide a better universal and targeted service platform? Such an investment will cost a lot, but we know the cost of not addressing child maltreatment also costs a lot in terms of social, emotional and financial costs to the community. And these costs can be outweigh the actual investment required to actually make the universal foundational services work. We know from some good work going back years now, 40 years in some cases, we know that in some of the programs that have been running, we can actually save money when we actually invest in prevention rather than waiting for harm to befall children. So what can we do to see the public health model properly enacted? How can governments resist the quick fix of needing to be seen to respond to each and every failure? Is the public health model an aspirational target we can't reach? Is that okay? Does it at least give us a goal to aspire to? Perhaps some of what we hear in the next few days will allow us to stimulate new approaches or new solutions or provide some insights that might give us a way forward. A few years ago in another presentation in Melbourne, I posed some other questions around statutory practice that you may wish to consider in the coming days as you attend sessions that might inform some other new solutions or give you food for thought. Should we, for example, divorce the forensic investigatory process more completely from the broader helping professions, from the health and welfare fields? Should police auspice the combined child protection police joint investigatory teams that are already active in virtually all jurisdictions? We know police have been developing some great forensic interviewing models. Maybe we should have a forensic social work service or psychology service that is part of the criminal justice system, signifying more clearly that role in child protection process of being focused on investigation for protective and criminal justice purposes rather than a therapeutic response. Would this provide clearer roles for professions and clearer understanding by families of the respective roles played by support services and statutory services? Would that assist in a clearer differentiation between statutory action and the broader response, the therapeutic response to children and families in need? Would it make it easier for child and family services to work with families and get better outcomes if adequately resourced? Just food for thought. I'm not suggesting this is the answer, but I think it's worth considering. Should we go further? Let's get crazy. Should we find ways to encourage families who are struggling or are at risk of maltreating their child or who are actually harming their child to seek assistance voluntarily by providing access to confidential services such as the confidential doctor systems used in Belgium and Germany? That is, should we shift further from enforcing legal sanctions to creating a non-punitive therapeutic alternative, a complementary pathway, if you like, that encourages parents to seek access without fear of punishment. Now, these European systems still enable reports to be made to statutory services where the concerns are severe enough to warrant that. So it's not actually getting people off the hook. It doesn't mean you can go away and abuse and harm your children, but it provides more of a therapeutically focused approach, a less threatening approach. The benefit is the less severe matters that would normally be dealt with through voluntary case plans in our current system would be better able to be managed to good outcomes, provided, of course, support services have been resourced to provide that therapeutic support, because if they aren't there, the whole system falls down, as we know. Should this be proposed and accepted in Australia? Particularly in the moment, given we've got this tough-on crime attitude currently evident in the media, in governments and in elements of the community. And we also have a very strong expressed desire for punishment from some sectors of the community too. Might these services, though, offer a way forward, for example, for recent immigrant populations who are often struggling with issues of trauma that they've brought with them while attempting to navigate acceptable parenting practices in the Australian context without adequate culturally appropriate support? Could we create culturally secure, confidential doctor services for our new immigrant populations to actually encourage them to seek help and get support rather than leaving them to become traumatised further and to actually harm their children? What are the risks of such an approach? Would we be able to keep children adequately protected? I don't know the answer to this, but I'm posing it as a question because I think it's worth considering. We have to change our systems, and maybe some of these ways are ways to do it. We also still have a long way to go to reduce the various harms and levels of violence in our Indigenous populations. While New Zealand, with its 30% Maori population, has led the way in developing many of the innovative solutions we currently use, there's a growing call that we develop not only culturally appropriate practices in this country, but extend significantly Aboriginal and Islander controlled and staffed services that can be supported to work with their peoples and engage communities in actions for change. I experienced this directly in the Northern Territory, where I worked for some 5 years throughout the intervention, which I'm sure you're all aware of. And as far as I'm concerned, the only way to go is to actually engage communities better to address some of the issues that are being faced in the Northern Territory communities. Canada has some really interesting models of service that are worth exploring and considering there. They now operate a number of state and provincial First Nations statutory child protection services. It's actually a First Nations child protection service. They've also got out-of-home care services run by First Nations agencies and, of course, family support agencies as well. These have not been without teething problems. They're not perfect services, but they have had a positive effect. Associate Professor Eileen Cummings, who's joining us on Wednesday to talk about her experiences, lives this work in Aboriginal communities across the Northern Territory. And I think you'll hear some valuable insights from her when she speaks on Wednesday on how to engage Aboriginal communities more effectively. Do I think we're going to solve the child protection problem over the next few days? No, I don't. But I do hope the presentations and the discussions that we have together may generate thinking on where we have come from, perhaps on some of the issues I've raised this afternoon, and also hopefully on some other issues as well that I haven't thought of, and maybe they give us some pause, if you like, to consider where we're going next and to try and inform the development of our services to do a better job at protecting children and enhancing child-family wellbeing. My hope is that what we hear, what we discuss, what we learn will assist us in developing innovative approaches to protecting children and supporting them and their families. To my mind, this was always the value of ACCAN, and I hope this 13th conference will be as stimulating as its predecessors. Thank you very much.